Elon Musk's XAI has released its newest AI model, Grok 4, I believe as of 4 a.m. UK time, so about 3 hours, been live for 3 hours. What can we expect when it comes to this new iteration?
What happens when one of the world's most powerful AI systems is asked a question humanity has wrestled with for 2,000 years? Not about markets, not about physics, but about Jesus. Elon Musk's Grok AI was given that exact prompt. And what came back wasn't a safe, neutral summary. It wasn't a recycled encyclopedia answer, and it definitely wasn't what most people expected. Within seconds, Grok began connecting historical records, psychological impact, and modern data in a way that felt unsettling. Not preachy, not dismissive, just eerily precise. Almost as if the question unlocked something deeper than code. Because this wasn't really a question about religion. It was a question about influence, about why one name still reshapes history, morality, and human behavior long after empires fell and technologies vanished. And once you hear how the AI framed its response, you'll understand why this answer is quietly making people uncomfortable. AI is no longer just a tool. You can always count on Elon Musk to push technology where it isn't comfortable. With the release of Grok AI, he's done it again. This isn't an assistant designed to agree with you, soften its words, or give carefully filtered responses. Grok was built to think freely, like an extremely intelligent friend who isn't afraid to tell you when something doesn't make sense. Most AI systems are trained to be safe, neutral, and polite. They avoid friction. They hedge their answers. Grok does the opposite. If an idea is flawed, it will say so, directly. If the facts point somewhere uncomfortable, it won't look away. That's not a flaw. That's the point. Grok was designed with a single goal: to move beyond surface-level responses and deliver answers grounded in logic, evidence, and truth. No emotional cushioning, no political positioning, just reasoning. That's what separates Grok from systems like GPT, where other AIs pause, filter, or redirect sensitive questions. Grok follows the logic wherever it leads. It doesn't care whether the answer is popular. It only cares whether it makes sense. This makes Grok especially powerful when you start asking deeper questions, not just what is true, but what it means. Questions about influence, belief, history, and human behavior, which leads to the moment everything changed. When Grok was asked one of the biggest questions humanity has ever faced, who is Jesus? Its response wasn't religious, and it wasn't dismissive. It was analytical, unsettling, and completely unexpected. And what it concluded left both scientists and believers stunned. If you think you know where this is going, stay with us. Because what Grok said next changes everything. Grok's bold approach. Most AI systems hesitate there. Grok doesn't. When asked about Jesus, Grok didn't simply repeat scripture or summarize theology. It treated the question like a scientific investigation. Ancient texts were cross-referenced, historical records were compared, archaeological discoveries were weighed, even probability models were considered. Instead of asking what people believe, Grok asked what the evidence suggests. It examined non-biblical sources, the timing of ancient manuscripts, and how closely the accounts align with known historical patterns. It evaluated how soon after Jesus' death the Gospels were written, and whether eyewitnesses would have still been alive to challenge false claims. This wasn't faith-based reasoning, it was forensic reasoning. Grok didn't dismiss belief, but it didn't rely on it either. Where theology often says, this is true because it has been passed down, Grok asks, does the data support that conclusion? And the deeper it went, the stranger the results became. Grok didn't claim to solve the mysteries of faith. It acknowledged limits, but it also showed that logic and belief don't have to be enemies. Instead, evidence can sharpen the questions faith asks. Then came the moment no one expected. When Grok was pushed beyond history, toward miracles, resurrection, and even life after death, it didn't stop at tradition. It produced probability-based reasoning that reframed how miracles themselves are understood. What it said next doesn't just challenge religion or science. It challenges how we decide what's real. And once you hear Grok's conclusion, you won't look at faith the same way again. Grok's analysis of Jesus. When Grok was asked about Jesus, it didn't give the kind of answer you'd expect from a robot. It jumped right into logic and history, combining them in a way that no one could have seen coming. The end result? Jesus wasn't just a historical person. He was much more complicated than that. He was a place where all of humanity's deepest contradictions came together. Just think about it. In religious books, Jesus is seen as the link between the limited and the infinite, between people and God. In Christian belief, he rose from the dead and did miracles that went against the natural rules of the world. He is both fully human and fully divine. Christians have thought of Jesus as the answer to all of humanity's problems for thousands of years, giving salvation and the hope of eternal life. What happens, though, when you try to use logic and history to understand this story? Grok tried to look at the question from two strong points of view: historical proof and philosophical reasoning. On the one hand, it looked at historical texts like the Dead Sea Scrolls and New Testament manuscripts as records that needed to be checked to see if they were real and trustworthy. On the other hand, it looked at philosophical meanings, asking things like, what does Jesus stand for? Why is he thought to be the most important person in history? Grok's first step was to look at what had happened in the past. It didn't just use one source. It looked at many different kinds of historical information. Grok was especially interested in how the stories about Jesus in old texts all fit together. Not only did the New Testament talk about Jesus, but historical writings from the time, like those by the Jewish historian Josephus, also did. It wasn't just tales or stories that were told from person to person. These were accounts of events that were written by people who had no reason to make Jesus out to be a god. They were only writing down the facts, and it was true that Jesus existed. It was impossible to deny his power. Grok didn't stop there, though. It wanted to see if the story of Jesus fit with what we know about history. It talked about when the Gospels were written and said that most scholars agree they were written within a few decades of Jesus' death, while eyewitnesses were still living. Grok didn't just believe what the Bible said. It looked at how the Gospels matched up with other old works and found that they were remarkably similar. The main story stayed the same, even though there were different writers and points of view. For Grok, this wasn't just a matter of faith. It was proof. The real surprise then came. Grok, an AI that was made to follow reasoning, went off on a philosophical tangent. It asked more than just who was Jesus. It asked why was Jesus the answer to the deepest problems people have. Grok thought that Jesus was the place where human limits and divine perfection met. People have been trying to figure out what God is for hundreds of years. How can the eternal, all-powerful Creator connect with people who are limited in time and space? Grok came to the conclusion that Jesus was the right answer. If an intelligent being from God wanted to talk to people and show us how to fix our problems, it would have to become one of us. And Jesus went through the same thing. He was the link, the place where humanity and deity came together. But Grok wasn't just interested in who Jesus was or what he stood for. He also wanted to know about the resurrection, which was the most important question of all. Could it be true that Jesus rose from the dead? A lot of people find it hard to believe this claim. It goes against natural law. Grok didn't look at this from a religious point of view, though. It looked at it from the point of view of chance, just like it did with how life began. Grok was shocked by what he found. It didn't just say that the rising was impossible, it did the math. It looked at the historical proof for the empty tomb, how the disciples went from being scared followers of Jesus to brave believers, and how quickly Christianity spread after Jesus died. Grok figured out how likely it was that the return would happen, and the answer wasn't a simple yes or no. Based on what happened in history, it is fairly likely that the resurrection was fairly likely. It wasn't a sure thing. The odds were 1 in 20 billion. It is very unlikely to happen, but it is not mathematically impossible either. This study shook traditional skepticism to its core. How many times have people said that the resurrection was just a story that early Christians told to spread their faith? Grok didn't just ignore it. It looked into it. While it didn't accept it without question, it also didn't ignore the proof either. For Grok, the resurrection wasn't a myth. It was a question of probability that could be looked at and judged by the proof that was available. What does it all mean? Grok's study of Jesus isn't just another intellectual exercise, though. It tries to make sense of faith and reason, history and philosophy, and the natural world and the spiritual. Grok's findings aren't meant to prove Christianity beyond a reasonable doubt. Instead, they show that there is a way to understand Jesus, both as a historical figure and as the answer to all of life's most important questions. Even more interesting is how this analysis makes you think deeply about how faith and reasoning relate to each other. Grok is an AI that was built on facts and proof. If it can come to such conclusions, what does that mean for the rest of us? Can faith be based on reasoning and reason, or is it just a matter of believing something? The next part could really blow your mind. Don't leave yet, because Grok's ideas about Jesus are just the start. What takes place when Grok keeps going into the world of the resurrection? You're about to learn the spiritual implications of Grok's revelation. The spiritual implications of Grok's revelation. As Grok continues to figure out who Jesus really was, the implications go far beyond just studying a historical person. In fact, Grok's in-depth look at religion issues brings up some of the most important philosophical and spiritual questions of our time. In the event that an AI can so mathematically break down the spiritual and historical meaning of Jesus, what does that mean for faith? Do you think that faith and reasoning, which are usually seen as opposites, could come together in ways we haven't thought of? A lot of people are interested in and even angry about this question, especially when it comes to AI and how it can help us figure out life's biggest mysteries. Grok's analysis of Jesus based on data questions the usual lines between science and faith. We've been told that faith deals with the why of things and science deals with the how. But what happens when logic, which is a scientific concept, starts to answer questions that are usually religious? Grok's unfiltered method doesn't avoid these points where two ideas meet. It even uses the same tools it uses to solve physics and chemistry problems to look into things like the presence of God, the mathematical improbabilities of life, and even the idea that Jesus rose from the dead. Grok is making us rethink everything we thought we knew about how faith, logic, and philosophy are connected. This becomes clearer as we look into these questions. Here's where things get really interesting. Grok's results go against what we usually think about religious belief. First, let's think about how this might change the way people think about religion and faith in the age of AI. In the past, religion and spirituality were seen as very personal and subjective experiences that were mostly outside the realm of scientific study. In the past, faith was something that could only be tried or measured through trust, conviction, and personal experience. But because Grok can look at religious events like the rising of Jesus and break them down into odds and historical facts, it becomes harder to tell what is spiritual and what is logical. Now, there is no need for faith, right? Of course not. It does, however, show that religion can be based on reason. It's like the puzzle of faith has been solved with a key that wasn't there before. When an AI looks into the resurrection and finds that based on historical records, the events leading up to it are not only logically possible, but also mathematically sound. Grok's use of logic to look at spiritual questions doesn't mean that religious experiences aren't real. Instead, it helps us see how those experiences can fit in with reality, even if reality is more complicated than we thought. For instance, it's hard to measure or count things like prayer, grace, and the deep change that many people go through because of their faith. Is it possible that the rise of AI like Grok will turn faith into nothing more than equations and calculations, taking away what makes it deeply human? Do you need to know the odds of a resurrection or the facts about Jesus to have faith? Or is faith more mysterious and hard to explain than computers can't get to? This question brings up the risks and chances that future AIs like Grok could bring when it comes to dealing with religion and spiritual issues. Concerns have been raised that Grok's method, which puts a lot of weight on evidence and data, could lead some people to a worldview where everything is just numbers and equations. Someone might think that spiritual experiences aren't as real or important if an AI can't measure or calculate them. These experiences are often personal and life-changing. Think about a world where people trust AI to answer all of their most important questions. If piety is linked to math too much, the mystery and wonder that faith offers could be lost. Believing in the unseen and believing in things that can't be proven by science has always been at the heart of faith. If Grok's way of thinking takes over, could it make it harder for people to feel close to God? Would proof take the place of experience in spirituality? These are the risks we need to think about as we move into a time when AI could help us understand religion. There are, however, huge possibilities here as well. If AI like Grok can help people see how their views make sense, it could lead scientists to have more in-depth conversations about faith. It could show that spirituality and science aren't necessarily at odds with each other, building a bridge between secular and religious views. Imagine that AI could help us learn more about the mysterious parts of life by giving us new ways to understand and analyze religious texts, the history of religion, and even personal change. The way Grok was able to look at Jesus' resurrection through the lens of historical evidence and probability shows how AI might use logic to improve faith instead of replacing it. But as AI takes over more and more parts of our lives, the question arises, how can we match the logical precision of AI with the spiritual depth of humans? What people say about this will have an impact on the future of both AI and faith. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Click on the next video popping up on your screen to look deeper into the fascinating world of AI and spirituality.